Here on the Colour of Country Life Flow FM, we're speaking with Matt Dalgleish from Thomas Elder Markets. How are you, Matt?
Good, thanks, Rikki. Thanks for having me.
No worries at all. Now, let's start with the beef market. How are things travelling on that front this week?
Domestically, we've seen the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator is pretty much going sideways, just above 1,100 cents carcass weight. But we have seen heavy steers increasing, which is a good sign for producers. That's up near all-time highs again now at 470 cents a kilo live weight.
All right, and to what extent can we see or read into what's happening on the processing front? Is there any hold-ups there that's affecting demand?
We have seen, I guess it stems back to the saleyard, Rikki. We've seen with the floods in New South Wales and wet weather in Queensland, we have seen some saleyards impacted, and so getting animals to the saleyards been a bit of a problem, and obviously to the processors as well, just getting them on the trucks and moving through those waters, or even going to farm that are a bit wet underfoot. So we've seen some supply issues, and that's kind of what's behind some of this increased pricing I think we've seen in the last few weeks.
Right, and are there some international factors at play as well? I think there might be a bit going on in the American market, probably on the opposite side of the coin to Australia. They're struggling with their numbers.
Yeah, that's right. We have, so the last 3 years now, they've been in a bit of a herd liquidation phase. They're obviously, often when we get a La Nina effect over in Australia, which is obviously wetter, we're seeing across the eastern seaboard, within North America in particular, they go into a drier pattern. So they've been going through drought the last year or so. And that's kind of instigated a bit of a turn-off there. So there's fairly high numbers of slaughter, and their cattle herd's declining while ours is on the rebuild.
Yep, good news there. I guess whilst it's incredibly wet in the paddocks when getting it to market, ultimately it means there's more feed going to grow, and longer term things should be pretty good on the cattle pricing front, maybe into the next couple of years. Yeah,
look, I think next year we're forecasting pretty strong prices again, and there's a lot of moisture that's going to carry through. The La Nina is expected to travel into next year as well, so that's giving producers a lot of confidence. I think, in terms of price decline potential, I think we're looking to probably 2023, the latter end, or maybe into 2024. I think the next phase will be once we start to get to a more normal season and look towards our next drought, which is probably only a couple of years around the corner, unfortunately.
Hopefully you're wrong, but you could well be right. What about on the sheep front? How things moved on the markets this week there?
So we're still seeing, the spring flush coming through in Victoria particularly, although it's running, I guess, a bit below schedule. So numbers are running lower than what you'd consider the average trend. We're about 20,000 head a week less than what we normally see. So that tightness in supply is meaning that, we have seen, prices drift down because there has been increased supply, but it's not as tight as it's tighter than what it was last year. And that means that pricing for sheep, particularly say something like trade lamb, we're sitting about 100 cents above where we were this time last year, so at around 850 cents a kilo carcass weight. There is some speculation that the kind of late start to spring in terms of the colder weather we've had and the rainfall has been limiting lamb growth. So there is some speculation that we might see some lambs coming through towards the back end of the season and into next year, so the spring flush has been a little bit delayed, and that could continue to pressure prices as we head towards the end of the year.
And are there any localised impacts like those you're mentioning? I know there's not as wet in the southern part of New South Wales, for instance, as it's been in the northern part of the state. Are they having some supply issues getting sheep to market down at Wagga, for instance?
It's not as much impact as we're seeing in the cattle space. There are lower numbers going to the saleyards, but I think that's more a factor of the general tight supply across the kind of market, in terms of the rebuild of the flock as well, and which is also that's the rebuild for the flock is the last most recent ABS numbers just came out for the September quarter, and that shows that the strongest rebuild we've seen for the sheep flock on record in terms of how active those restockers are. So that's obviously, a factor there also, kind of supporting price for sheep in that space. The real strong intent to rebuild the flock is there, definitely.
Well, just to sort of wander off topic for a little bit here, but it does seem to me, looking at when you mention record prices, it does seem to me that we might be heading to, between cattle and sheep collectively, a record size of the flock. Is this a reason why there was a little bit of balking about methane targets on the Glasgow Climate Change Conference?
Look, when you say heading towards a record size of the flock, we're certainly looking at MLA's forecast. We are looking at a rebuild for sheep. I think they're talking close to 70 million head by the end of this year now, is what the MLA prediction is. So, you know, that's a significant jump up from where we were historically. But, I mean, from the sheep perspective, it's a long way off from the 140 million head we had pre the wool reserve price crash. So there's a fair way to make up if we're going to get back to those big numbers. And cattle is probably not dissimilar. That, you know, we have seen higher herd sizes, you know, if you go back historically. But the climate aspect's an interesting one because there has been a lot of concern around particularly methane emissions from livestock. But, you know, from my perspective, I don't really perceive that as being the biggest, kind of problem in terms of emissions. If you look globally, livestock emissions account for less than 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, the Australian flock going up a little bit and the Australian herd going up a little bit, I think is going to be, not the big concern when it comes to emissions. I think we've got to focus on things like energy and transport.
Oh, yep, you may well be right, but it's good to keep track of those numbers anyway, and I guess analyse why policymakers make the choices they do as much as we can understand it. Matt, thanks for joining us here on Flow today. Much appreciated.
No worries, Rikki. Take care.